CZ Whitney, followed by Susan Harvey, and Allison Denlinger is on deck.
Good morning, almost good afternoon again, Commissioners. Charlie Whitney from east of Santa Margarita. I served on the original Ag Tourism Working Group, and I would like to thank staff, specifically Karen Nall and Brenda Overkirk, who spent untold hours and evenings, days with us, sometimes with our committees, in trying to draft some kind of framework for something that would work for ag tourism. One of the problems that we had is that there were approximately 4 people that objected to just about everything, especially when we came to events. I think there were roughly 20 people, maybe a few more. Karen could give you those numbers that were on the working group. And one of the people was a legislative assistant for the 5th District Supervisor at the time, so I could never figure out why she was on the working group. One was an alternate for the other 2, and the other 2 were essentially the principals of the Ag Tourism Coalition, which is really a misnomer. Actually, what it is, it was a neighbors group who object to practically everything that had anything to do with any type of ag tourism, specifically in their area. Finally, out of exasperation, staff allowed them to do a minority report so that they could express their objections, even though they were pretty much overridden in what became a voting system so that we could get through the process. The bias I see here evidenced by the fact that the process is allowed to have been hijacked, and it was allowed by certain members of the Planning Commission, was allowed to have been hijacked by the Ag Tourism Coalition. This is not what the Board of Supervisors had in their intent when they first brought this whole concept forward. A couple of things here also that I think show some bias is that Commissioner Christie, some years ago when she was fighting against the Santa Margarita Ranch, referenced vineyards as alcohol farms. Timing is not about the economy. The timing is because it's politically expedient. You have the right people on the Board of Supervisors right now to put the kibosh on anything agriculture essentially wants to do to keep itself in business. As far as retaliation goes, which was expressed here as a concern earlier, Commissioner Christie championed the use of aircraft to search for violations at one of the Planning Commission meetings a couple of years ago. Virtually no one here supports the direction you are taking at this time. You may get a few more members towards the end here of the Ag Tourism Coalition who do support it, but you're not going to get many. My suggestion is go back to the Board of Supervisors, get some direction from them, get rid of the bias that's showing up in this thing. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Whitney. Susan Harvey is our next speaker, followed by Allison Denlinger with Elizabeth Rolfe on deck.
Good morning, Planning Commission. My name is Susan Harvey, and I'm speaking for North County Watch today, and I'd like to identify myself as a member of the Ag Tourism Coalition and our group. I'd also like to express how disappointed I am that so little of this conversation has been on the issues of what we're talking about here and has, devolved to some name calling. It's not the way that things get handled well in legislative processes, and I find it extremely disappointing. I'd like to point out a few things on the, this is question number 28 on the CABO survey. It says, without non-ag events income, would you maintain your land's agricultural production activities at the same level as currently, or would it currently stay the same? 75% answered that it would stay the same. They would, without ag events, they would still stay at the same level. The question here, we're talking about an ag events ordinance, not a wedding events ordinance. If we want a wedding events ordinance, then let's talk about that under some other guise, but let's try to stay with what the thing is. If people have issues with Ag Policy 6, then they need to go and revise Ag Policy 6. If they have issues with the accessory uses or the temporary events, then let's look at that. But let's try to stick with what the issues are here. The other thing I'd like to point out is that UC Davis did come out with a recent survey, which I thought was very interesting. And it was about ag tourism. When I read the whole thing over, it looked to me like most of it was directed towards actually accessory events to agriculture. I didn't see, I think there was one little chart about something about retreats and weddings and stuff, but most of the stuff had to do with agriculture accessory. And it showed that 50%, I think the number was like maybe 53, of ag tourism dollars came from the same county as the event was held in, and then something like another 30% came from a neighboring county. I just thought that was kind of interesting because I haven't seen a lot of real statistics here, a lot of discussion about what might be happening. I also like to read this from, this was on that same website, from the Obstacles in Agriculture's Agritourism Regulatory. El Dorado County adopted a ranch marketing ordinance to encourage ranch marketing. The ordinance now requires ag tourism operators to have a minimum of 5 acres of permanent crop or a minimum of 10 acres of seasonal crop to qualify for commercial activities, and allows a graduated scale of ag tourism production based on operation size. I think there's a lot of not sticking to the issues here, and I really appreciate the effort that you've put into this. I also like to point out that the Ag Tourism Coalition met for months with planning commissioners, planning staff, and the public right out here to discuss this for
Thank you,
a
Ms.
long
Harvey.
time. Thank you.
Allison Denlinger is our next speaker, followed by Elizabeth Rolfe, and David Garth is on deck.
Good afternoon. My name is Allison Denlinger. I also am a member of the Ag Tourism Coalition. I am here this afternoon to support the draft ordinance before you today. For over 20 years, my husband and I have dry farmed walnuts on Vineyard Drive in Paso Robles. During the past 5 to 10 years, we have seen a huge increase in the many negative impacts that events and commercialization have had on the rural character of our area and our right to our peaceful enjoyment of our property. Increased use of water, traffic, noise, trash, and lack of enforcement are the major problems that have occurred. Each time an additional commercial facility is permitted, the planning staff states that these problems can be mitigated. But how do you mitigate the lack of water? Truck it in? How do you mitigate 10-car trips a day to 100-car trips a day? Widen and straighten the road and ruin the rural ambience? How do you mitigate trash? And how do you mitigate the lack of enforcement? This ordinance does address enforcement. It places the burden on the individual holding the event, and permits do not run with the land. But there is no way to mitigate the other issues except to limit the events. I have heard it said by opponents of this draft that farmers are not buying agricultural land to have events, but you can be sure that if there is no requirement that the land be actively and primarily used for agricultural production, that will soon be the case. The more activities that can be held on ag land, the more valuable it becomes, thus putting the cost of land out of the reach of serious farmers, and thus beginning a vicious cycle of obliterating the very thing that we should be striving to preserve. Weddings can still be held at wineries. Wineries have the infrastructure for weddings. They have the bathrooms, parking, kitchen facilities, etc. With over 350 wineries in the county, or even 200, surely there are enough venues to choose from for the weddings without impacting additional productive ag lands. By setting limits on the types of events, where those events can take place, and how many attendees, and how often is the only way to preserve the beauty and uniqueness of this county's rural areas. To do otherwise will destroy the very things that brings tourists here. Just how much commercial activity can be allowed on ag zone land and the land remain agriculturally viable? If there are no restrictions as to what activities are allowed, then the county should change the zoning from agricultural to commercial. Please remember that the entire ag tourism proposals have yet to be presented to this commission. They too will allow farmers to increase their income by allowing farm stays, food processing, farm stands, etc., and that by limiting and defining events, you will not be restricting the only means that farmers will have to supplement their income. I ask that you please approve this proposed event ordinance. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Denlinger.